Her research focuses on computer security, where she uses tools from econometrics and insights from traditional computer science to analyze cybercrime. She's going to talk about shaping cryptocurrency gatekeepers with a regulatory trial and error. And also with us is Percy Benegues, who I'll present later on. Please.
Thank you. Do you want to use the mic? Oh. I can sit down? Yeah. Great. Okay, thank you, everyone. So I'm a bit of an outsider to the community, being a computer scientist, though I've started to do quite a bit of work looking at regulation of cryptocurrency exchanges, because the thing is that there's been quite a lot of technical approaches here. And despite all of the technical innovation in this space, we still see that so many cryptocurrency exchanges and cryptocurrencies writ large are fundamentally unsafe. And so I'm going to present some work. That I've been doing recently along with my PhD student, Marilyn, who is there a way that I could be muted? Great, thanks. So this is work done along with my PhD student, Marilyn, who's a PhD in student computer science and has a legal background, as well as my colleague, Ingolf Becker, who is a crime scientist. And so together we have this multidisciplinary group that has tried to look a lot more into cryptocurrency exchanges, and this is one of our projects. Lovely. So this is kind of a timeline of cryptocurrencies. So the Bitcoin white paper released in 2008, the code was live in 2009. And then it wasn't until 2012 that we had the first report put out in the EU. So that was the EU Central Bank that did this report. And it was right before the death of Mt. Gox. Mt. Gox was this prominent cryptocurrency exchange based in Japan. It was originally started as a way to trade Magic the Gathering playing cards. That's the name, Magic the Gathering Online Exchange. That it then pivoted to cryptocurrencies when the person who started it was interested there. It had a lack of regulation, and despite that, it still managed to be the dominant player at the time. Where it eventually failed, it got hacked enough, it had enough insider trading. It's not clear if that was a malicious outsider that was purporting as an insider or a true insider that was going on. And then right after it failed, there was a number of other reports that came out. And note that those are all before the Ethereum network was live in 2015, which is a really big shift in cryptocurrencies. So before then, there was only about 10 players, and Bitcoin was about 90% of the lowest amount of cryptocurrencies that were traded before Ethereum was live was Bitcoin. But with Ethereum, it allowed it to be a lot easier to make cryptocurrencies. And so it really exploded the space. It made the design cycle so much quicker. It also allowed us to have so many different sorts of instruments that we have today that never would have been allowed without the technical functionalities that Ethereum gave us. I'm mostly going to, though, focus on some later regulation that was put out in 2020 and later. So there's this EU MLD update, as well as a FATF update. And I will give a brief talk about some of the current legislation that's being in talks now, though it has not been enforced yet. And so at a high level, cryptocurrency regulation aims to create some sort of safe economy for consumers. And they do that by discouraging bad actors. So they discourage bad people from trying to get cryptocurrency, but also discouraging bad actors to try to start cryptocurrency companies, because that has been historically quite a big issue in the space. They also want to encourage good actors to protect consumers. So they want to encourage people that want to do it well to be able to do well. And then also, discourage money laundering and terrorist financing, which are the classic things that we think about here. The key issues are different based on who I give this talk to, because a lot of times I talk to people that are quite a lot more technical than me, and they point out quite different issues that in this crowd. So at a high level, the internet is largely self-regulating. Before I got into cryptocurrencies, I was mostly looking at malware and phishing and other bad stuff on the internet. And that's entirely taken down by private actors that talk to other companies. Government is largely outside a lot of the regulation of the government when you think about the sorts of things that I do. The cypherpunks who started Bitcoin are largely suspicious of government, and a lot of times being government free in a lot of ways is seen as a good thing. And there's always going to be an issue with this rapid, ever-changing technology. I recently went to a workshop on decentralized finance and decentralized stuff on top of Ethereum, and people were talking about technology that like very, very few people are experts at. You could get them all in this room, and there'd probably be about as many as there are of us. So next I'm going to be talking about some of the specific regulations before I get into some of the issues at a high level. So the first thing in Europe that was put out was the central bank report in 2012. It considered a lot of different types of virtual currencies. It particularly used Bitcoin and this in-game currency for this game's Second Life, as they're both virtual currencies with a bidirectional flow. So here, they've considered other virtual currencies like airline miles that have a unidirectional flow. So you can take your money and you can buy airline miles, but you can't take your airline miles and get out money, as everybody has figured out in the pandemic. And the really big difference here is that something with a bidirectional flow has a lot more opportunities for abuse. So most things, even now, that only have a unidirectional flow, they're largely unregulated. In this report, they raised the issue about the use of the cash rather than the format, which is a bit ahead of its time. And it highlighted that the lack of proper legal framework substantially exacerbates the other risks. And we'll notice this coming up again and again and again, where the legal people will say that there's not this proper legal framework, but it's still not clear what that legal framework should look like. The next report I'll talk about is in 2014, right after the fall of Gox. There was this report from the FATF, which is a group of over 30 countries that come together. And they talked about how this anonymity that cryptocurrencies give you, though it's not true anonymity from a technical sense, paired with a global reach could facilitate potentially regulatory coordination issues. I would say that even in 2023, there is not a truly anonymous currency, both in the technical side and in the use of how people do use cryptocurrencies. The use of cryptocurrencies usually makes it inherently non-anonymous. They pointed out this regulatory shopping issue. It was somewhat of an issue for Mt. Gox because Mt. Gox was based in Japan, and most of its consumers were based outside of Japan. We've also seen how decentralization causes existing techniques to be tricky to adapt, particularly seizure of assets. So in other sorts of assets, you can grab it. The banking industry for years has come up with ways to grab assets, where with cryptocurrencies, the same sort of techniques don't apply. It's quite a lot more tricky technically. It also talked about a number of case studies. So it talked about Liberty Reserve, which is this centralized digital currency, most of which went to things like Ponzi schemes. It also talked about how there is this international cooperation to take down the large drug market, the Silk Road, and this large cybercrime group, the Western Express. Then there was a FATF report that was an update to the earlier one, but it actually outlined how existing recommendations applied to cryptocurrencies. So here it's the first report. It was just like, hey, this could be interesting. Let's look at this space. This report actually went into some recommendations. And one thing I'm going to start to highlight now is the terminology, because the terminology is quite different across different people. It's not super consistent. And the terminologies a lot of time have baked in assumptions that don't necessarily mean what we want them to mean. And so here in this document, they talk about virtual currencies as well as virtual currency payment products and services. And they highlight a bunch of different recommendations that are already existing that apply to cryptocurrencies. And I pulled out two that we thought were particularly interesting. So they had recommendation 15. And here it requires companies to ensure that financial institutions manage or mitigate risk before launching new products or businesses. And basically what they said is that this includes cryptocurrency exchanges. So before they launch new products, they have to think about managing the risk. So note how this is just a summary of what it says, but it isn't that much more technically different than this in the work. And so the vagueness allows quite a lot of interpretation. We'll also highlight regulations, recommendation 16, which pertains to wire transfers. And it considers virtual currency transfers to fall under this. And it requires all of the due diligence that you have to do with wire transfers. So it requires you to know who the originator and the benefactor of the transaction is, as well as have some sort of extra monitoring over a large amount, so over like 1,000 USD. They then updated it in 2019 to be more specific, because the issue is here is that the previous one, it was just so vague that it really couldn't be enacted. And so now they updated it and they added an interpretive note 15. And the big add is that they said that virtual asset service providers should be required to be licensed or registered. And they also said some of the same things that they said previously, like they should apply a risk-based approach to virtual assets. They discussed this travel rule to monitor transactions and collect, hold, transmit user information to local financial authorities and other virtual asset service providers. So the travel rule is quite controversial when you talk to more technical people. There's quite a lot of issues here. One big issue is that cryptocurrency exchanges aren't very good at managing data. So if you look at how many breaches there are here, it's quite a lot. And when exchanges get briefed, they don't always steal money, but they do sometimes steal personal information. And the more personal information that they have to collect to do their job, the bigger the target they are. They're also required to flag suspicious transactions. However, it relies upon the member countries to actually implement this rule, and it's not binding. So here, with a lot of other things that the FATF puts out, non-compliance ends up with the country on a gray list. This was then updated in 2021, where they updated the regulation recommendation 16, which is again the regulation about wire transfers. And it expanded the scope to VASPs as it currently had, as well as, quote, unhosted wallet transactions, which are ways of transacting with Bitcoin, not through a service provider, but on your own. It encouraged the freezing of transactions to suspicious people, though it's not quite clear how to do that. It discussed the need to implement sanctions on non-compliant VASPs. And it also pulled a little bit back on the travel rule. Again, that was largely due to some of the issues because cryptocurrency exchanges don't necessarily trust each other. There's a number of bad actors in the space. It's not clear that a bad actor would enter the space in order to get personal information to do bad things. And so here they didn't require sharing with other VASPs when the transaction was considered low risk. Now, this is a little bit out of timeline order, but before this was done, the EU's anti-money laundering directive was updated with the Directive 5. And notice that they have different wording. So here they talk about virtual currencies, they talk about custodian wallet providers, as well as providers engaged in exchange services between virtual currencies and fiat currencies, which is somewhat of an arbitrary distinction between players. Some of this looks a lot like the FATF directive that came after it. So here it titles subjects to regulatory requirements in a lot of ways as banks. So they tried to look at a lot of the regulations for banks and just kind of copy pasta them over to cryptocurrency exchanges. So now they have to acquire licenses and register with authorities and have some KYC, monitor suspicious activity, all of those great things. And it also allows government regulators to obtain the addresses and identities of owners, again, towards the KYC. So with all of these, and this is just, we decided to limit it to Europe because there was only so many bits of cryptocurrency regulation that we were willing to look into. During the same time, there's been quite a lot of regulation in the States as well as Japan, though I haven't seen good translations of the legislation in Japan, as well as the regulation that has made the news in China. But there's fundamentally this issue of regulatory shopping and escape. It's the internet. You can pretend to be anywhere you want to be if you have enough technical sophistication, which if you're trading in cryptocurrencies, you likely have. And then you can also, if you're running an exchange, there's a number of case studies, we'll get to one in a minute, of exchanges that have physically just moved their corporation around in order to get around regulation. And here we see the different regulators simultaneously will just test out various approaches that will be somewhat overlapping, but not completely. They apply somewhat differently because they use slightly different terms. So if we cover online wallets, that's quite different than something that covers software wallets. Those two things are quite different. And some software wallets are online, and some wallets aren't either offline or software. And so it can be really hard to narrowly say what you mean it to say and also have it interpreted by everyone in the same way. We also notice there's an issue between thinking about exchanges. So when we've done follow-up work looking at some of the regulations over exchanges in particular, there's quite a difference between centralized exchanges, whereas there's also decentralized exchanges. There's even back in the early days of Bitcoin, back in 2011, the primary way to get Bitcoin was this peer-to-peer exchange, Bitcoin over the counter it was called. And we've seen with increasing levels of regulation, there's some people that are really interested in that sort of peer-to-peer, direct on the street sort of exchange, which then makes it a little bit harder to have the intermediaries responsible for those platforms come under appropriate levels of regulation. There's also been constant amendments and variations, and those amendments and variations, they get put out every few years, and then they are enacted sometime in the future, and they still do leave some loopholes, and they also aren't updating quick enough to cover some bleeding edge technology. And in this space, there's quite a lot of bleeding edge technology that's coming out all of the time. So here's an example. If we look at two bits of legislation that we just looked at, the AMLD5 from the EU, as well as the international FATF, we notice that AML5 adopted definitions that don't cover tokens, particularly they don't cover investment tokens and utility tokens, because it didn't really consider those sorts of things. The use of these tokens, which are bits of software built upon Ethereum, aren't really regulated as well as more traditional types of currencies like Bitcoin, though I'm using traditional loosely. It also leaves out decentralized cryptocurrency exchanges. and other sorts of non-custodial service providers. So service providers where the people have the access to their private keys so that they can transact in the currency without the service provider's consent in many cases. And thus, these sorts of services need not comply with this anti-money laundering directive, even though we would assume that the EU would have wanted to cover all of these specifics. It's just that the way that they wrote the legislation carved out these loopholes. There's also quite low compliance with regulation. So 56% of cryptocurrency exchanges had, quote, weak or porous KYC processes in 2020. And 60% were out of compliance in Europe, 40% in the UK. And they found that like 48% of all obliged entities in Europe were registered. It's low compliance, but it's actually higher than I assumed. And one thing that launched because of this was this like cryptocurrency laundering as a service, where criminal organizations started running cryptocurrency exchanges. They were running ATMs. Cryptocurrency ATMs are illegal in the UK right now. And including running them, they use them, and some of the exploited exchanges did include quite popular ones. Like when we thought about this beforehand, we would have assumed that most of the money would be transferred through like not very well-known ones, but actually criminals have been quite able to hide in the noise in the large cryptocurrency exchanges. There's also this lack of consistency in terms, I've talked about this before, virtual assets, virtual currencies, all of these different ways of talking about places where they have cryptocurrency, some of which you can trade between two different cryptocurrencies or trade between a fiat currency and another one, others of them just standalone wallet providers. All of these we'd likely like to regulate. They have different issues. Like if you're interacting with trading currencies, that's quite a different risk profile than just holding cryptocurrencies. But again, it's quite confusing. A lot of these terms are quite confused, and they're used incorrectly at times. And that can make it hard for the technical people to take the regulators seriously if they can't even understand what they're trying to regulate. It's unclear if cryptocurrency products are assets, commodities, or property. The US tax authority feels quite differently than other people. And there's quite inconsistent laws based on location, and they're even inconsistent within a location like Europe. And a good example here is looking at Binance, which is a very large cryptocurrency exchange. It was opened in 2017 and very quickly rise to be one of the most popular. It's known for trading quite a lot in quite a long tail of different sorts of currencies. When I did work on pump and dump schemes, quite a lot of them used Binance. It has a big global reach. It has this new Binance.us entity that's exclusive to the US market, though that's not just unique to the US. They have Binance Turkey. They're now talking about creating Binance Poland based on the regulation there. They started off as a Chinese company, though based on the regulation there, they then proclaim themselves to be a decentralized company, and like who knows where they are. And during that time, they were registered in a number of places, including Malta, and Malta then talked about it not being properly registered there. So it's a bit complicated, probably purposely so. They're currently non-compliant in the UK, they're non-compliant in other places. For example, they're fined in the Netherlands for lack of compliance. Though they are currently in compliance in other European countries. I believe the last time I looked when I was making these slides, they were indeed compliant in France, for example. If you look into their terms and conditions, they also consider themselves to be very special. So they consider themselves to be subject to the laws of Lithuania when their transactions involve some sort of fiat currency. However, for all other transactions and all other issues, they want you to consider the laws of Hong Kong. There's also a fundamental issue with cryptocurrencies that it's really hard to protect non-recoverable assets. So there was a study done in 2018 by a group of computer scientists that found that half of cryptocurrency exchanges fail, and that the average lifetime is about 451 days. About a quarter of them experience a breach and announce that, though in this paper, I believe they only consider breaches where they lost cryptocurrency. I believe the number is much larger than that because they're just subjecting it to the ones that are announced. They're also just wanting the ones that where you lose currency. So it's quite common for exchanges to be breached. And then all of the usernames and user emails are leaked so that they can run phishing attacks on people that are that are customers of the exchange. There's not really clear best practices for how to run an exchange. There's lots of academic work here about how to do different sorts of things about the cryptography. And there's quite a lot of academic thought here. But the problem is that in order to do those sorts of things, you need really expensive cryptographers that there are very few of in the world. And this technology is constantly improving based on the attack surface. It's expensive, it's hard to understand, and it's even harder to implement. And the issue with cryptography, if you get it slightly wrong, then it's completely wrong. It's not a grayscale like other sorts of technical risk. There has been some insurance cover in cryptocurrency exchanges, though they really don't fully provide cover, and a number of insurance agents promptly left the market after they started insurance exchanges. There's also no lender of last resort. So in other sorts of banking systems, there's like a central bank that, like, if one bank fails, then the other people then their customers can go to some other bank, and there's not that sort of thing here. And there's no, like, if the exchange is hard up for money, they have no place to go to get a quick infusion of crypto. There's also a big burden of compliance. When I've talked to people that are running cryptocurrency exchanges, they all point to this, and about just how many different regulations they have to fall under and how many bits of paperwork that seem to be covering exactly the same thing. KYC is really expensive, and many cryptocurrency exchanges are startups, so they outsource their KYC. Though some still refuse to do any KYC, and they advertise as KYC free. Given the average lifetime of exchanges and how slow regulation is to do it, this does make sense to have, because by the time the regulators get to you, you've closed down and opened up another shop. So we also have some thoughts about what's next. So there's this markets and crypto asset regulation in TFR, where they're proposing a stricter travel rule, which makes cryptocurrencies easy to trace. In the cryptocurrency spaces I run in, this is quite controversial. They're mandating collection of information related to originator and beneficiary, regardless of the size. It's contradictory to the FATF, and it also is just requires a lot of trust in other cryptocurrency exchanges that most cryptocurrency exchange runners just don't have. It looks to be aiming to be some sort of unifying regulation in a manner similar to GDPR. Though I would actually argue that that would be a good thing, because the regulation here in the States doesn't seem to be any better. Though what we've noticed by reading different drafts is that the language has been substantially weakened over time, maybe to the point of not being particularly useful and enforceable. And we're also interested in seeing how exchanges are going to respond to increasing regulation. So we look at if once a new MiCA draft gets out, then we have seen that exchanges have tried to put more in their legal text. But beyond that, we've noticed that exchanges will, for instance, block users in New York after regulation was passed there. Though, is Europe too big to block? We've seen exchanges that have blocked the US, and the US has more manpower in cryptocurrencies than Europe does right now. So if the US is not too big to block as Europe. And kind of the analogy here is US websites that are banning EU viewers post GDPR. So as a conclusion, there's quite a lot of changing regulation. I've picked a a small subset of the regulation, hopefully the most interesting ones. There's also just a lack of coordination on terms and a lack of use of consistent good terms by governments, which just makes it harder, and it makes it harder for technical people to take it seriously. There's low compliance even with clear policies, which again lack a poor translation of the policy. And there's this, outdated regulation on ever-changing technology that results in a lot of bad things like backdoors, regulatory shopping, and lack of trust. And fundamentally, there's a hard thing because each exchange works very different than every other exchange. And so we'd encourage the work of exchanges to standardize more, which would make them much easier to secure. And if you'd like to reach out to us, I put our email addresses here. And yeah, thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Marie. To talk about asymmetric certainty in crypto investigations, we have with us Percy Venegas, who is online. He's editor-in-chief in the Journal on Policy and Complex Systems from King's College London. Thank you, Percy. I leave the floor to you.
Thank you. Thank you to the organizers for the kind invitation. Let me see if I can share my screen. A second. Perfect. So we're going to talk about a computational, financial computational approach to crypto investigations. And it's also about the changes. Perhaps you have been following the news about the bankruptcy of this exchange FTX, and it's all over, right? What is not all over the news is the hack that happened there the day it went bankrupt, and it's a little bit tricky, the incident. So it has to be approached with a combination of regular chain analysis techniques and also behavioral techniques. And what we're going to use to study this is a type of generative AI. So if you have been seeing, this sites that create using a chat, create text for you, right? We are using the same here, but basically to create hypotheses, right? And this is a project that we have been running with, at the LSE, and basically we create computational models that are creative inside. So in this session, we will cover the incident. We will talk a little bit about tracing the on-chain activity, in the blockchains when this event happened. We'll talk a little bit about this technique to generate the hypothesis automatically. We are gonna do some exploration of the off-chain behavior. So everything that happened outside of the blockchains when this happened, and then we're gonna look a little bit at modeling. And here the news at one of the prevalent financial news networks. And here there is the CEO of a forensics company talking about the weirdness of this incident, right? The bankruptcy was announced on a Friday afternoon. On a Friday afternoon, you have this hack, right? Then the money was moved across some blockchains, and the perpetrator didn't even have enough money to pay for the fees to move the money, so they lost a lot of money on fees. Basically they did a lot of sloppy things, right? But the question is, were those really errors from an amateur and this one employee, or was this just part of the plan to cover the trades, right? There were so many strange things here in this hack. So if we start tracing on-chain tracing regular of the cryptocurrency, and this is the certain part, right? We know that with cryptocurrencies you have a ledger, and there's a lot of public information, non-anonymous information. So you expect that there's some certainty, right, in what you are looking at. And if we start tracing the drainer address, the address of the perpetrator of the hack, we will see something like this. Basically, there are transactions, there are some wallets involved, there are some smart contracts, because some of the funds were moved to decentralized changes. There are basically computer programs that that are not like a centralized change. But very quickly, things start getting complicated, right? And at some point, you have a network that is many times bigger than this one that we are seeing right now, and the problem becomes hard, even if all the information is certain, right, and deterministic. And we find. But anyways, if we have the right things, we can find interesting nodes in the network, right? Places where a lot of the activity converges. In this case, we're looking at Uniswap, which is a decentralized exchange that was used in this hack. But the problems that we have so far, one is tractability, right? With the on-chain ledger data, it becomes too large too quickly. The other problem is that we're missing the behavioral component, everything that is happening off-chain on the web, right, or in apps. And here is where we bring the generative AI technique. In this case, we're talking about symbolic regression, genetic programming, and basically this is a technique that makes a search of the space of what we are studying, and using some specific criteria of how much novelty you want in your hypothesis, how much complexity you want in it. You can find a group of models that are good at predicting, at the same time are good at finding things that are unexpected, right? And basically you have variables. We can deal with thousands of variables. You have observations, right? You can deal with millions of observations, and some mathematical operators. And basically, as this is an evolutionary algorithm, what you have is variation, right? Like you have parent mathematical expressions and changes in this in these expressions, and there's where you have the basic fundamental mechanism of evolution working, right? In this graph at the lower end, we see the blue dots are models. Usually you generate hundreds, thousands of models in one run, and you can plot them by accuracy and complexity. And usually what you are trying to look for is the models that are on the knee of the plot, because those are the ones that are less complex and at the same time have less error. So are good at predicting, and are tractable for humans. A human can read the mathematical expression and understand what's going on. So this is explainable AI, and it's also less computationally expensive to implement. And what you have when you do this is it's a bunch of mathematical expressions. And if you pick a sample of those expressions, in this case, something like the red points that you hit that you see here, basically what you have is a graph that it's giving you the confidence. The confidence metric is embedded on the prediction. So in the y-axis you have what you're predicting, and the left axis you have the values of the variable that you're looking at. And you have a bunch of models, and they tend to agree when it's they're constrained by the data, and they disagree when they have to go in the wild and predict and same things. But in general, you have an average and some divergence, right? And the consensus or lack of consensus is what gives you this this measure of certainty. So how can we use this to explore the data of the the behavioral data, right? What is not on the blockchain. So one of the benefits of the technique is that we can make a search and reduce the search space, from thousands of variables to just a few dozen, right? And in this case, what we did is that we took daily visits and total page views to around 400 sites during this period before the hack. And the data set looks somewhat like this. As you can see, this is a problematic data set for any other AI technique, right? There are a lot of correlated variables. There is a lot of missing data. What we're seeing here is basically in the y-axis is time, right? The pass of time, and in the x-axis we are seeing the different websites, right? So some websites that we are studying are have a very constant kind of information, right? They're displaying like usage by the population that is very constant. Others didn't exist, and then they were blank, and then you start seeing activity and so on, right? But with symbolic regression and unity programming, this is not a problem, right? This technique can deal with all those issues on the data. Okay, so what is the modeling plan? In the case of this exchange that we are studying, FTX, the over-the-counter trading desk is basic, as in many other changes. It's basically an operation that caters to high net worth individuals, right? So people who are making big movements, right, and big transactions, they use this specific office right inside the exchange. So we are using the usage of this service as a predictor variable, as a goal for modeling. And the predictor variables are all the websites that the people who use that over-the-counter service use. So anything that anyone uses, crypto trading services, information services about finance, other exchanges, centralized or decentralized, anything that has some presence on the web, not only in the blockchain, that is used by users of the exchange. So these are all the variables that we are using as possible predictors, and we reason that that movements in over-the-counter trading should respond to activity in certain services used by customers of the exchange. And we do 2 rounds of modeling. In the first round, basically what we do is investigate what are the interesting variables. So what are the variables that appear together more often in the models? In this case, we generated over 1,000 models, and we found that consistently these variables that were that are here in the plot were appearing together, and some like the ones that are in purple were showing stronger associations. So we went from having hundreds of websites to investigate to just have these ones, right? And this is an important productivity gain, right? And if we plot the mathematical expressions in the same way as we explained before, what we will see is something like that, right? Basically, we have an ensemble of models, right? I'm not showing here the different models in the ensemble for simplicity to the eye, but basically there is an upper band of the models that are giving predictions at the upper end, and there's a lower band and there's an average, right? And for two of the variables that we just reviewed, this is how this looks like. So the first thing that we notice here is that the asymmetry characteristics are different, right? This one here is a trading platform famous for NFTs and similar assets. And this one here was a training service that is not operational anymore for people that wanted to learn about crypto. And we see that here, because of the divergence, we have more uncertainty, and it's also more information, right? There is a level of surprise here that might be interesting to investigate. So we take that route, right? And if you remember in the tracing of the crypto, when we were looking at blockchain data, we found that Uniswap, the decentralized exchange, was one of the changes that was used to move the money that was hacked, right? The crypto that was hacked. So how this, that is, usage of web services relates to this, that was happened on the blockchain, right? And the interesting thing is that there is an overlap. If you look at the usage of the web version of Uniswap, which is this app, you see that there are a lot of there are a few other sites that people use when they are using Uniswap, right? And each one has a metric of how much an estimate of how much this overlap is. And as we can see here, users of Uniswap also use OpenSea, which is what we discover in our modeling, right? So this indicates that off-chain data can effectively complement on-chain activity by means of uncertainty reduction. So we start with a modeling process that reduces uncertainty until we get to these overlaps, right? And this process was literally done in 8 minutes, right? Like the first round of modeling was 5 minutes or so. The second one was like 3 minutes, and we arrived, to this insight. So it's possible to use these insights, this process and this insight to anticipate a malicious actor behavior. As you remember, we model data from 2 years before the hack, right? And when the hack happened, the bad actor actually used one of the services that we discovered, right? So it means that you can actually be a step ahead. Like you can do this modeling and you can know if a hacker is going to perform a bad activity, what are the likely services online that they will use to do this. So you can anticipate a malicious actor behavior. So what are the conclusions? We have argued that Luther trying to obfuscate the investigation will use services popular among the community of legitimate users, right? They will try to do this to put confusion, right? And make the investigation a little bit harder. But this technique detects those of chain services, providing an embedded metric of certainty, right? The asymmetric characteristics of the confidence measurement indicate promising variables that can be further investigated using on-chain data. And in this case, we found a match, right? Some of the blockchains used to move the funds were associated to the type of assets traded in the particular changes and services that were discovered, right? So there's a match between the more certain blockchain activity and the quite uncertain, on-chain activity. By the way, all the data of the websites that we are using is anonymized. Conclusions, there are two sources of asymmetry. On-chain data is certain, but off-chain data is not. And this is a source of information asymmetry. And the other is the divergence of certainty in the behavioral data, and this asymmetric uncertainty. And what are the policy implications? Regulators and or investigators will benefit from monitoring critical crypto financial infrastructures, including these niche service providers, right? Like these small exchanges that fly under. There are many of them decentralized, but they have some operations on the web. And this can be done as part of regular standard operational procedures or forensic activities. And with this, I conclude. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Percy. And with that, I open the floor to any questions that there might be. Or even some afterthoughts from our speakers. I don't know if you want to add something to what we talked about today.
I appreciate, you did say you were looking at legal aspects as well, did you? A couple of branches then. Given that you're reviewing these past studies and past recommendations and the current regulatory framework in Europe, particularly not, and the UK, or just because at one time we were together, now it's moving in different directions. So, I mean, given that you started off by saying that the objective was to create safety for consumers, I mean, isn't it even more of a mess now than it was at the start of all these studies back in 2012 and 2015? There's no, do you see, what I'm really getting to, the question is, do you see some kind of coordination of a regulatory framework, either, never mind the UK for the moment, within Europe? And also, you didn't mention the recent Basel Committee, just 16th of December it was, their final report on the increased risk to regulated banks, to Basel Committee banks for crypto assets, which they talk about the fractional reserves, which, as we know, aren't even adequate for normal banking, never mind about exposure to crypto risk. So, and that's a Basel Committee, yet another regulatory body, which you could argue is actually one of the most powerful, because it does actually have all the banks, so after all, have got all the money. The real money, by the way, in cryptocurrency is not money, you know that legally it isn't. That's one thing everybody does agree on now internationally. There's one or two countries that have legislated to make it legal tender in their countries, but the most legal opinion internationally is that whatever this set of ones and zeros are on a server, they're not money legally. But I just wondered, where do you think that the direction of travel is in terms of harmonization, so that the average consumer that wants to invest or do whatever they want to do with whatever this product is, can feel that there is one overall harmonized regulatory framework? Or is that just a wild dream that I should forget about and go and dream about something else?
They really value decentralization, which means they're going to do something differently than else's. And then once you have too many competing bits of software trying to implement currency exchanges, it just becomes increasingly hard to problem. I think I'm a bit encouraged by like people that are running cryptocurrency exchanges that are trying to be boring. I think, yes, there's a number of those there, and there's enough in the space, and they are becoming more dominant players, and they're also becoming more attractive to retail consumers. And I think if we can focus there and trying to make adequate regulations as they want it to those players, and we might not ever get on the same venue. And they also will like run their own cryptocurrencies. Not only do they do all of these retail things, but they also like run their own, which is often where we see people. But I think we can like force exchanges to move out of Mexico, and then also regulate the ones that want to be regulated. I think I would be happy there. I mean, the thing is that it's really hard to know, right? Like, I started doing cryptocurrency work back in 2011, and I never would have predicted, like, I mean, I remember when they were crowdfunding for Ethereum, and they finally got enough money so that they didn't have to build it as a layer on top of Bitcoin. It actually became its own thing, and I remember that just being mind-blowing, and just being so ahead of the curve. And I think that's just one of the issues here, that it's so quickly, but it's not clear that we might have some technical innovation in the next 5 years that makes everything better. But I think that they really do need to get their act together for major. Like there's a number of countries in Europe that ban them. I think that way of looking at it is going to become more.
Yes.
Sorry, just going back to the UK, you'll be familiar with the Law Commission's current consultations on digital assets and decentralized autonomous organizations. I don't know what your view of that is. A lot of us have given a lot of input to them and have been a bit alarmed at their approach in particular in dreaming up this terminology data object, which is a perfectly well, like 50-year-old good term of art in IT, and they seem to want to snitch it for something. I mean, if they're going to start regulating data objects, then they've got to start regulating all data objects, which means that every 1 and 0 on a server suddenly falls under some regulatory regime, which is bizarre and ridiculous because it's totally unregulated.
Sorry, they're thinking of moving just because of it. And if they continue this regulation that seems wholly unserious and somewhat combative, because using inappropriate terminology like that does come across as unserious and somewhat combative, I don't think it's particularly helpful. And I think it just causes more startups to leave the area, which is not necessarily what we want. But who knows? Yeah, well, I mean, I think they're trying to. Yeah. Well, I mean, it is the EU, it is the UK, right? They've had a number of really interesting bits of regulation that only they have thought of, or like, I started doing research through the Stop Adware project, where we tried to reduce the amount of malware on the internet. And the only government player that was at all involved in the space was the Metropolitan Police, that was acting on outdated data, which just made the UK seem like a non-serious player in the space as well. So I think they're a bit known for that. So it's a bit concerning.
I don't know if there's other questions. That's
Still to Marie. I was wondering, did you do any research on a small city called Zug in Switzerland? And do you know if they have any regulations there? I'm from Zug, by the way. So.
I'm aware of Zug. I'm not aware of particular legislations. So I'm aware of Zug, and I have friends who live there, but I'm not currently aware of the regulatory framework there. Though I hear it's friendly, but I'm not quite sure what that means.
Percy, I don't know if you want to add something.
Well, perhaps to the last question. I know that the ecosystem in Zug is quite well developed, and they even have some banking facilities, similar to what Silicon Valley does with the startups, that they give them the possibility to bring funds and create entities easily. So yeah, there is a good integration between the regular financial system there and the crypto community.
Well, thank you very much. I think we can close the session now. We'll have a closing reception in 10 to 5. So hope to see you. It's going to be here outside. Thank you very much.
And thank you for running the show all day.
Thank you.
We all